It is Friday Eve. It's Thursday, April 28th. There's your Pear Deck link. Today we're going to be talking about the Indian Civil Rights Act. And, I'm not a huge fan of the title of this lesson because I know, the indigenous peoples of America, or Native Americans, as they're also known, they don't really like this term Indian because it's inaccurate. Indians are a people in Asia, in South Asia. But alas, this is the name of the act, the Indian Civil Rights Act. So, we're going to call it by the title, regardless of its correctness or not, its accuracy or not. Well, let's get rolling, because we're going to continue discussing civil rights and the civil rights movements in this country. And we've been, like most history classes, it tends to center and focus on African American and their struggles for rights. And we kind of leave out that there's other groups at the same time that are fighting for the same rights, but they don't have the outspoken leaders like a Martin Luther King or a Malcolm X, who we've talked about in previous lessons. They don't, for whatever reason, the annals of history, we don't highlight these people, which is why we're going to do that today. All right, I only got 12 of you in here. I have 46 in here. So here's that link one more time. Stress level today. Man, I think I'm about here. And the only reason being, it's just because I didn't get a lot of sleep. I'm sleepy today. I went to bed, and as soon as I closed my eyes, my kid got up. I was like, no. I went and got him back to bed, and he didn't want to go back to bed. And I thought I got him calmed down. And he's like in this phase where like he won't go to sleep unless somebody's in the room with him. And I'm trying to break him of that, where he'll just go to bed and go to sleep. But he's convinced like we're, having a huge dance party in the living room without him. So I have to be in there with him. So I think I get him to sleep, and incidentally, I fall asleep on the floor. And then it, comes to find out that this kid was just like faking it and got up and ran out into the living room at like 4 a.m. and just started having a dance party. My wife found him at like 4 a.m. And then found me sleeping on his floor. And then she left me there. And I woke up at like 6 a.m. all stiff on the floor, and I walk into the bedroom. She's in bed. He's all curled up. And I'm like, you guys are a bunch of jerks. He was faking it. Dude pulled one on me. So, like, this is like my third cup of coffee. I've got the trusty pot right here. And, we're trying to salvage the day here, but I'm hoping by about noon I'll be down to here. Or if I finish this pot of coffee by the end of class, maybe I'll be up here. Who knows? But that's where I'm at right now. And, yeah, all by himself. Like 4 a.m. He was like all in the living room. He was like, nobody's here to tell me no. I've got all my toys here. I can get in the fridge. Now I can hear him, and he's in the other room right now watching Coco on the Kindle. Energy is wasted on the youth. All right, here's that Pear Deck one last time. We've got stress levels all over the board today. Again, as usual, if you're past a 5 and there's anything I can do to help you bring it down, particularly if you're stressed about this class or anything else, if there's, you just need somebody to talk to or something like that, reach out. Okay, please know that I'm here for you. Okay, guys? But let's look at today's learning target. Today, you should be saying to yourself that I can analyze the growth of the American Indian movement. by identifying key events in the 1960s and 70s. So again, we're going to continue with this theme of the 1960s and 70s as being this really volatile time for social movements, right? We could realistically compare them kind of to today with a lot of the movements that are going on right now with Black Lives Matter. You could say with women's rights activists and protests and marches that are going on with that. LGBTQ activities and activists and some of the laws that are being passed in, I guess, opposition of those movements. And it's not the first time that we've seen this in our history, okay? And that's really the point that I'm trying to get across. And please understand this acronym, AIM, AIM, is American Indian Movement. But just a little background. Since the founding of the United States, natives of the Americas have found it difficult to find solutions for their grievances in the American court system. They've kind of been overlooked. Okay. The primary reason has to do with the law. The laws were not written for them. Okay. The laws were written to get these people off of the land so American settlers, white settlers particularly, could go and settle westward, right? This all has to do with really one of the first things we talked about when I took over as your teacher was westward expansion. Again, the law doesn't care that the Native American tribes were considered separate nations. They weren't even considered part of the United States, or that the citizens of the tribes were not citizens. So you might have somebody who's a native living on a tribal nation in Oklahoma, but they don't have equal protections under the law. But they're expected to abide and follow those laws. Enter the Indian Civil Rights Act. In the 1960s, Congress decides to review the nature and authority of tribal governments. To aid tribal members in seeking equal representation and equality under the law, the Indian Civil Rights Act was passed in 1968. This law grants certain rights to all persons who are under tribal jurisdictions. I don't know a ton about the inner workings of tribal nations. I do know that they do. One second, guys. Apologies. Little guy just walked in watching Coco. It's like, no, you can't be in here. Maybe another day. Anyhow, I don't know a lot about the inner workings of tribal nations, obviously, because I'm not a part of it. No, Coco, the Disney movie. Yeah. He just wants to hear. He likes the songs in that movie. But the Indian Civil Rights Act basically models itself off of the United States Constitution. Okay, the ICRA, or the Indian Civil Rights Act, included the ability to exercise free speech and freely practice religions of their choice. Another provision protected tribal members from improper search and seizure of property. There's also several other provisions that provide tribal members with quick and speedy trials, trial by jury, due process, and no double jeopardy. Right? These are all rights that we as American citizens are guaranteed under the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. But Native Americans did not, who lived as a part of a tribal nation, they didn't have these rights until 1968. The ICRA authorized federal courts to enforce the protection of those rights. Some American Indians resent that aspect of the law because they see it as an infringement on tribal sovereignty. Okay, so the whole idea of the Indian nations is that, yes, they were like separate countries. They were sovereign nations. The federal government couldn't really tell them what to do, which is why they didn't really have the rights. They still had to follow the laws, but their land was their land, and they could operate on their land basically as they saw fit. Some of them, however, saw that this ICRA was the federal government trying to control them. So some liked it, some didn't. But what I want you to do is make a connection. Okay? What connections can you make between the civil rights for Native Americans and the civil rights for African Americans? Right. So we've talked about two distinct ethnic groups or racial groups, just trying to fight for equality and have an equal say in our country in this experiment. What connections to both of these? What are there? What similarities? And if you can't think of anything, tell me two differences. Give you guys a minute or so while I fill up the old coffee mug. No cream, no sugar. I like it as is. That's how I like it, Rose. Yeah, Ben knows. Some argue that this is the way that coffee was supposed to be drank because that's how it was originally made. All right, let's look at some of these. It was both hard for them. Yes, you are right, but I would like for you to try to dive a little deeper, dig a little deeper into it. What other concepts can you make connections with? Okay. So if that was your answer, it's not a bad answer. I just want you to go a little deeper if you can. Both were treated unfairly because of their background or roots. They had to fight for basic rights. Love it. Good one. And a couple of us are still hung up on it. So that can be one we come back to. Hey, I like tea too. So let's look at this American Indian movement, or AIM. The nation's history is peppered with armed conflicts involving natives. Really, guys, if you were here in August, September, early October, we talked all about it. You talked all about Indian conflicts, Battle of Wounded Knee, things like that. Really, all of westward expansion was an armed conflict with indigenous Americans. And these generally came to a close with the end of the 19th century, right? So by the time we get out of the 1800s into the 1900s, most of these conflicts came to an end, mostly because most of the natives were wiped out. Yet from 1969 to 1973, clashes again erupted between Native Americans and the white establishment. A politically and socially active group emerged that called itself the American Indian Movement. AIM members began demanding equal rights for all Native Americans in the United States. They built on what was going on with the Civil Rights Movement. So they didn't do this as opposed to the Civil Rights Movement that African Americans were fighting for. They did this because of that, right? They saw what was going on with the Civil Rights Movement with Black Americans, and they said, hey, we can do that too. Let's take that model and apply it to our struggle and see if we can't fight and win our civil rights. And it adopted a mix of civil disobedience and armed resistance. So this is going to get a little violent. After centuries of trying to attain equal status through legal and political means, this faction of American Indians became more radical, meaning they became more extreme. In 1969, AIM activists rallied against the second-class status of American Indians in the U.S. They occupied the prison island of Alcatraz in San Francisco to protest the conditions of American Indian reservations. As if you ever do any research or go on an American Indian reservation, they are historically very, very, very poor places. They're stricken by poverty. And if you look at a lot of the major issues that affect like big urban centers of like poverty, generational poverty, kids going to bed, hunger, lack of shelter, things like that, a lot of those things are exacerbated, meaning they're intensified in certain parts of Native American reservations, but we don't see them because we're not on them, right? It's also important to know that Alcatraz shut down as a prison in 1963, so there was no prisoners there. Okay. But the occupation of Alcatraz by these activists captured media attention. Then, on Thanksgiving Day in 1960, as Boston was marking the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims arriving in North America, the activists from Ames seized and captured a replica of the Mayflower. The following year, they occupied Mount Rushmore, and then a few months later, they attempted to take over the Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters, which we'll talk about in the next couple slides. In 1973, they took control of the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota for 71 days. Pine Ridge was the site of the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre. Okay. But quickly, the federal government stepped in to try to stop them. Usually that involves guns. But in the summer of 1972, at the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota, a powerful protest began during a gathering of the tribes for the Sundance Ritual. The leaders of several tribes met. Those leaders were named, and you guys don't need to know these guys. You know, you're not going to be tested on these men's names. Leonard Crow-Dog, the meeting's host, was the spiritual leader of the American Indian movement. Robert Burnett was the leader of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, and he's the one who came up with the idea of staging a protest. Burnett wanted to use the 1972 presidential election to spotlight American Indian concerns. The candidates would have to address their situation if the protesters could grab their attention. The protest would be called the Trail of Broken Treaties, referring to both the Trail of Tears and the government's broken promises to these Indian nations. Later that September, the leaders all assembled, and they decided that a peaceful protest caravan driving from the West Coast to Washington, D.C. would generate news headlines. So that's what they were going to do. Where are we at so far? How does everybody feel about this stuff so far? Make sense to you? As far as Native Americans' civil rights movement and we're gonna Native Americans want civil rights, they want equal protections, and they get it in 1968, but they're still not too happy because they're treated like second-class citizens in the eyes of the government. So they come together and they decide we're going to create a caravan protest and drive across the country protesting to DC during an election year. Similarly, today there is a trucker caravan protesting all sorts of things. I believe they're going to be in Columbus this weekend. They're doing this really the same thing. They're driving across the country and protesting and causing big traffic buildups and things like that. So let's look at this Trail of Broken Treaties. The journey begins. On early October of 72, the Trail of Broken Treaties caravan set out from 3 different sites on the West Coast. 3 leaders, each bearing a sacred pipe and accompanied by drummers, were to meet on October 23rd in Minnesota. There, they authored a paper that outlined their desires. The paper explained the American Indian movement's philosophy of land reform, proposed modification of the treaty process, and was a long list of unaddressed grievances. So they wrote out everything that they wanted, all of their demands. The paper demanded that the government recognize the sovereignty of individual tribes and honored the treaties it had violated. All they wanted, like the government brokered these treaties, guys, with these tribal nations, and then immediately broke them. And that's really one of the big things that they wanted was just give us what you said you were going to give us, and never did. With this document in hand, the 3 groups united into one caravan and then headed east. They were joined by hundreds of other protesters along the way. When it rolled into D.C. on November 3rd, the Trail of Broken Treaties caravan was a 4-mile-long fleet of buses, station wagons, and pickup trucks with almost 1,000 participants. Okay, so this was not a small deal. But as they traveled, AIM organizers agreed that their first stop is going to be the headquarters of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Okay, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was a government agency that had been the source of grief and frustration for these tribes since 1824, since it was founded. The caravan's vehicles jammed the streets around the BIA building, and hundreds of protesters crowded at its doors. Fortunately, the building had an auditorium, and the protesters filled the seats, and a tense dialogue with BIA officials was started. But at 5, this discussion got nowhere. And at 5 p.m., the building was closing, and the security guards requested that they vacate the building. And at that point, the protesters snapped. They got up from their seats, and they drove the guards out. Then they took over the building of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and renamed it the American Indian Embassy. And they occupied this building for, what did we say, 5 days till November 8th? Yeah, they occupied till November 8th. The AIM leaders negotiated an agreement with government officials who promised to appoint a task force. The task force would examine the group's grievances and pay for transporting its members home. Government officials also agreed not to take legal actions against the demonstrators for the felony crime of seizing a federal building. Okay, so again, there's in the news today, there's a lot of stuff about January 6th. There's a lot of those protesters and demonstrators who are getting arrested for trespassing and trying to take over a government building. Again, not the first that was not the first time this has happened. Now the motives and the purpose behind either movement completely different. But again, none of this stuff is new to history, right? So the government said, yeah, we won't prosecute anybody. Just get out of the building, go home. We'll pay for you to get home. But Bureau of Indian Affairs officials found out later that angry vandals had destroyed their records department. So they had gone in and basically, like, they kept records of like all of these tribes and family members and things like that. They burned them. They burned all of their records on all these people and all these tribes and all the stuff that they had on them. The Trail of Broken Tears began on a very noble note, right? It was a very noble person. But its breakdown of control during the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs gave the American Indian movement bad publicity and embarrassed its members, right? This was all on national news, right? It all started as like, hey, we want our equal rights, just like we seem to be giving everybody that has been treated like a second-class citizen in this nation. The Native Americans have been through a lot, and we want equal rights, and we're going to go and we're going to protest and have a movement, but then it gets incredibly violent. We take over a federal building, and now everyone hates us. Basically how it went. The negotiation regarding reforms went nowhere, especially with Richard Nixon, who was an incredibly conservative Republican, who would very, very soon become embroiled in a scandal with Watergate, which we'll talk about in the next couple weeks. Probably sometime next week, we'll get into Nixon and Watergate. Your exit ticket. Draw or type 2 things that you learned today. Okay. That's the exit ticket. I'll let you guys work on that for a minute. We got about 3 minutes left. We got a little early. Done a little early. Oh, the Christian, that's right. Joy. But I did want to offer this to you. If this topic was one that's interesting to you and you want to know more, check out this book. And I gave you the link. It takes you to Amazon where you can buy it. If you have Audible, you can listen to it for free. Fun fact, guys, if you download the Libby app, Libby, that's what it's called, the Libby app. I'm going to keep wanting to say act because we're talking about history and stuff. The Libby app, you can sign up for a digital library card, and you can sign up for your area, like your county library, and you can get free audiobooks like you were going to the library. And I listen to books all the time. Wow, Tyrone, we're not done yet, bro. But if you're interested in this topic, check out this book. It's called Indigenous Peoples: History of the United States. And it's just like this class. So like it goes through U.S. history from colonization to the present, but it's from the perspective of Native Americans. Okay. So it's kind of like one of those movies where you see the movie through one character's eyes, and then it goes back and tells you through another character's, and then goes back and tells you like the same events through another character's eye. You know what I'm saying? Just the different perspectives. And this gives a really, really detailed depiction of U.S. history through somebody else's eyes, right? And the common saying is history is written by the victors. And this is showing us, the loser's perspective, I guess. If I don't want to call natives losers, but just it's a very, very interesting and very eye-opening book. Okay. Your assignment today, don't forget yesterday's, guys, the U.S. voting history of U.S. voting rights Ed puzzle. Now, when I checked yesterday, not a lot of us has gotten it done. It's like a 8-minute video and a couple of multiple choice questions, and it's a completion grade. So as long as you do it, you get 100. But you have workbook 4.6 today, the Indian rights movement. Okay. Any questions, comments, concerns? All right. While you're typing, don't forget about the target sessions at 12:30 and 2:30. If you do have questions or comments or concerns that you didn't get to type out here, thanks for another great day, guys. Tomorrow's Friday, and we're almost done with this thing. All right. Have a great day, guys. We'll see ya. What's up, Kyoshi?